Hey, in today's video, we're going to talk about what successful entrepreneurs can learn from psychopaths. And what we're going to be getting into is really just explaining this little cartoon graphic that you can see on the screen right now. And we're going to do that by jumping to the iPad and going through sources and showing how if you are somebody who is thinking about starting a business or you have started a business, there's going to be a little bit of struggle with that process, right? It is an emotional roller coaster. And what I want to do in this video is show you how you can figure out why psychopaths tend to succeed in business more and what we can learn from them and apply to your business. So to get started, let's jump into the iPad and answer a few questions here. So first one up is, what percentage of adult males have significant levels of psychopathic traits? And I go to my little cheat sheet here, but is roughly about 1.2%. So what percentage of adult females have significant levels of psychopathic traits? Well, of course, they're beating us out here. It's about 0.5%. All right. So these are pretty low numbers. You walk down the street, 100 people go by you, maybe there's one person with significant psychopathic traits. Now, if you look at prisoners, unsurprisingly, a higher amount of psychopathic traits there. I've read in between 15 to 25% because it's not a perfect science. So what we're going to do is just call it 20%. But the one that was interesting to me that I've come across recently is the idea that 20%, literally 20% of business leaders have significant levels of psychopathic traits. So when you look at that and you're like, let's say it's 1% is the general population, 20 times more than that is what your C-suite, business founders, business leaders, all these people, why do they have 20 times more levels? Well, it got me kind of thinking about things, and I'm asking myself the question, why? Well, let's take a look at this. This is some really good information if you're somebody who is thinking about starting a business or has recently started a business. And maybe some of these but one study I read says that 92% of people with a business idea never start a business. And then you've probably heard this one before, is that 50% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. So going back to this graphic on the screen right here, I did not draw this. I had to commission somebody to draw this. On the left-hand side, we have what's known as the psychopath. On the right-hand side, that person may look familiar because it's me, all right? So most people are not psychopaths. So the thing about business is that at some point, you have to make a decision on whether or not you're going to start a business. So let's say you have this line that's kind of just looking like this. I'm just going to do this in live time. And what this line is your job, okay? Now, jobs are stressful. There's ups and downs, but it's a little bit more predictable than actually owning a business. Now, what you do is if you're thinking about starting something, anything, right? The way that works is that most of deciding and planning happens in the front of your brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. That is the part that has developed the most in humans over the last X amount of years. I don't know the number off the top of my head. But basically, we are different from other animals because we can look into the future. We can predict things. We have a large capacity for emotion, right? So if you're thinking about buying a car, right, it's not like you just go there and you figure out what the price is and a couple different details and you decide if you're going to buy it or not. No, we actually envision ourselves driving that car. What does it look like when I'm rolling down the street? How are people looking at me? How do I feel in this car? A lot of emotional-based decision making is what leads to the actual decisions that we do. So when you're in a job and let's say you don't like that job, you may predict, exactly what it's going to look like when you start a business. And what happens is that we tend to look at this like this. And now the reason for that is we're trying to predict the unknown. And when you're the business owner, there's a lot more unknowns than a job. So the typical person is like me, right? I was thinking about starting a business, but all of these doubts, fears, imposter syndrome, all of these things just start to wash over you. And you start looking at the possibilities. And yes, you can see the potential of this business that you're going to start and thrive in, but you also see the downside. Like, what if this fails? What if I get sued? What if I lose all my income? What if I lose my house? Just go down the list of things that your brain does. That's what your brain is doing. It's actually, a lot of it is actually happening in an area called the dorsolateral prefrontal association area or cortex. And that is where we make decisions. I know that's a mouthful, but basically right up here is where you are planning and deciding what you're going to do. So every person at some point has to reach a point right here. And what I call that is E-Day. That is Entrepreneur's Day, right? That is when you decide, I am an entrepreneur. I am going to do this thing, okay? It's not necessarily when you set up your entity, when you set up your website, when you make your first dollar, when you hire your first employee. It is actually a mindset in an individual that says, today is the day I have to draw a line in the sand. I'm doing this thing. Now, the reason that psychopaths are so interesting is that what makes a psychopath is not what we think it is, right? A lot of times we think of like what you see in the movies, and it's like serial killers and prisoners and all this stuff, but we don't really talk much about business leaders. And it's really interesting because there's an equal amount of psychopaths in business, in the top of the food chain as far as business goes, like C-suite founders, executive CEOs, as there is in prison. And there's a trait that a psychopath has, and what it is the ability to blunt their emotions when they are focused on a task. Now, we just talked about how as humans, we may have a lot of emotions happening up here. This is where we make our decisions in that prefrontal cortex in the front of your brain. Well, the psychopath is able to blunt those emotions. Now, why is that an advantage for the psychopath? Well, let's take a look at this and say that the psychopath is on a similar trajectory with a job, and they're thinking about starting a business. Well, for them, that process probably looks like this. And if they're a narcissist, it's even further up this scale, right? If the narcissist is like, everything I turn touches to gold. So the psychopath, when they're thinking about starting that business, and even when they start it, they're able to really blunt the other emotions. And those emotions are things such as fear and doubt and worry and anxiety, most emotions that the rest of us feel and experience every day, and to differing levels of severity. So let's go back up a little bit, right? Because this is important. 92% of people with a business idea will never start a business. Now think about it. Looking again at this image on the screen here, if you're the psychopath thinking about starting a business, why not do it, right? I think this is going to work. Those fears, anxieties, worries, all of that, not a big deal for me. Let's do this thing, right? Now, the other interesting part is that 50% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. A common misnomer that I have seen in business, and I had this myself too, was that people who founded businesses are geniuses. They are not. I've met a lot of them. Some of them are geniuses. Very few are. Most of them are people who have a high risk tolerance and a lot of belief in themselves, okay? So the psychopath, again, they have a high risk tolerance built in because they just can't feel the emotions that you and I feel when it comes to starting a business. So the other thing that's worth mentioning here is the 50% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. I don't believe that the psychopath actually has a higher or lesser chance necessarily of succeeding in business. I just believe that they step up to the plate way more than you or I would. And that's because, again, they don't have that part of their brain, all those emotions flooding it, saying, this is going to be a disaster, don't do it. So if the psychopath steps up to the plate 5 times and fails on their first 4 businesses and knocks it out of the park on the 5th, that's what people remember, right? So they had the ability to step up to the plate because it's a lot easier for them to envision this being a success and not being overwhelmed in their own emotions. So for me, this is about my 5th foray into business. I started as an entrepreneur when I was 13 years old. I owned a driveway sealing business with my 2 older brothers. My father was an entrepreneur, and he's like, here's the truck. I bought you a tank. You guys are going to do this. And that's what I did for a summer. So I started learning as an entrepreneur in that experience, but I didn't have to actually jump in. It was almost kind of like pushed on me. But I've had some failures as an entrepreneur, and I've had some huge successes as well. So what I have learned through the journey of entrepreneurism, though, is that you're not wrong in thinking this is what your experience is going to be. Looking at the iPad here, right? The dotted lines are you anticipating what it's going to be like to be an entrepreneur. There are more ups and downs as an entrepreneur typically than there is as an employee. And that is because you get to participate in the upside just as much as the downside. So the downside might be, the business pulls back a little bit. You have to lay people off. Like, those are really tough conversations and things you have to deal with. But on the upside, the business is doing great, and you get to, be in charge of your own flexibility and hours. You get to hire the people. You get to look at your vision and actually carry out that vision, as opposed to some manager pushing his vision on you. Like, it is pretty cool to be able to participate in the upside. But there is more upside and downside when you're an entrepreneur. What I want to do in the course of a few videos here with you is I want to teach you some skills that are going to allow you to skip the dip, right? So these points right here, this is what I'm referring to, the dips that you have as an entrepreneur, those emotional kind of hangovers. I want to teach you some skills, techniques, and tactics that are going to allow you to limit the downside as an entrepreneur. So this is helpful if you're thinking about starting a business, or you've recently started the business and you're in that overwhelmed process of like, what do I do next? That is what we're going to be covering in this series. So I really don't want you to be another one of these statistics, especially if it's being a psychopath, but I don't want you to be somebody with a business idea that never starts a business. And I also don't want you to be somebody who ended up failing at business because you just didn't know the proper techniques to limit the emotional dips of entrepreneurism. So in this next video on the screen right here, I'm going to teach you a little entrepreneur secret to not be another statistic. I don't want your business to fail, and I don't want you to not get started. And it's so simple, but when I break it down for you, it's going to make so much sense. So I'm going to catch you in that next video.